The battle for Novorossiysk was rooted in the broader struggle for control of the Black Sea region, a front that carried both strategic and symbolic weight for the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, its ultimate goals extended beyond the conquest of European Russia to the seizure of the Caucasus, the vital oil-producing region whose resources were essential for sustaining the Axis war effort. The Black Sea ports, Sevastopol, Tuapse, and Novorossiysk, were key points in this campaign. Situated on the northeastern shore of the Black Sea, Novorossiysk served as one of the Soviet Union's largest southern ports and the western terminus of vital supply lines connecting the Caucasus to the interior. Its harbor, protected by surrounding hills and deep waters, also functioned as a base for the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. By the summer of 1942, as the Wehrmacht launched its southern offensive under Case Blue, the German 17th Army under General Richard Ruoff advanced across the Kuban region toward Novorossiysk. The capture of the city would cut Soviet maritime access to the Caucasus, threaten the oil fields of Grozny and Baku, and provide Germany with a potential naval base in the Black Sea. For the Soviet command, preserving Novorossiysk was synonymous with preserving the entire southern defensive system. Stalin himself considered the defense of the Caucasus a matter of national survival. In the autumn of 1942, German and Romanian forces began a concentrated push toward the city. The 5th Romanian Infantry Division, supported by elements of the German 198th and 101st Jaeger Divisions, reached the outskirts of Novorossiysk in early September. Fierce fighting erupted along the Semes Bay and the cement factories on its northern shore. Soviet defenders consisting of the 47th Army of the North Caucasus Front and elements of the Black Sea Fleet transformed industrial complexes and port facilities into improvised fortresses. The terrain, steep hills, narrow coastal plains, and the deep harbor favored defense and complicated German logistics. For nearly 2 weeks, both sides fought for control of the port installations, exchanging heavy artillery and naval bombardments. On September 10, 1942, the Germans finally seized most of the city's western districts, including the vital cement plant at Mishako and parts of the harbor. However, Soviet troops retained a narrow bridgehead on the eastern shore of Semes Bay, a strip of land barely 5 kilometers wide, stretching from the port's oil depots to the slopes of the Markotk Range. This small enclave, later known as the Malaya Zem, despite the fall of the city's center, Soviet artillery positioned on the surrounding hills and warships, anchored offshore, continued to bombard German positions daily, denying the Axis full control of the port. Through the winter of 1942-43, the front at Novorossiysk remained static. The city lay in ruins, divided between German and Soviet control. The German 17th Army, stretched thin across the Kuban bridgehead, was tasked with holding a defensive perimeter from Anapa to Krimskaya while maintaining pressure against the Soviet enclave. The Axis command also relied heavily on Romanian units, whose equipment and morale were deteriorating rapidly after the disasters at Stalingrad and the Taman Peninsula. Soviet reconnaissance reported that the Germans lacked sufficient reserves and heavy artillery to launch a decisive assault on the little land. For the Soviets, this lull provided time to reorganize. The creation of the North Caucasus Front under General Ivan Petrov in early 1943, and later its transformation into the Black Sea Group of Forces under General Andrei Grechko, brought coherence to the defensive and offensive planning. The Stavka recognized that Novorossiysk, together with the Kerch and Taman bridgeheads, could serve as springboards for the eventual liberation of Crimea. Maintaining a foothold in the city also allowed the Soviet Black Sea Fleet to keep operating in the eastern Black Sea, despite the Axis occupation of most coastal ports. Civilian suffering during this period was immense. The German occupation authorities imposed strict control over the remaining population, estimated at fewer than 3,000 people by early 1943, and employed them for fortification work. Soviet sources recorded mass executions of suspected partisans and forced laborers, while German records noted frequent cement plants, oil storage facilities, and port cranes were either destroyed in combat or deliberately demolished. By 1943, Novorossiysk's harbor was filled with sunken ships and debris, making navigation nearly impossible. Nevertheless, the city's symbolic value endured. In Soviet propaganda, Novorossiysk was depicted as the fortress that refused to die. Its defenders, isolated for months, became national heroes. Supplies were brought in under the cover of night by small vessels braving German artillery and aircraft. The continued Soviet presence on the shore of the Black Sea was more than a military foothold. It was a psychological counterpoint to the Axis occupation elsewhere. By early 1943, the wider strategic situation began to shift. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February shattered the cohesion of the Southern Front. The Wehrmacht's 17th Army, isolated in the Kuban bridgehead, faced the possibility of encirclement. The Red Army's rapid advance across the Caucasus and the liberation of Rostov forced the German command to withdraw its forces from deep in the Caucasus and re-establish a defensive line along the Taman Peninsula. Novorossiysk, though devastated, became the northern anchor of this shrinking line. Both sides now prepared for a decisive confrontation that would determine not only control of the Black Sea coast, but the fate of the last German stronghold in the Caucasus. In the spring of 1943, the front at Novorossiysk remained one of the most complex and strategically significant sectors on the entire southern front. The city was divided, its streets filled with wreckage and the remains of abandoned armor. The Axis forces, led by General Ruff's 17th Army and reinforced by Romanian divisions under General Dumitrescu, entrenched themselves in the western and northern districts. Their defensive positions were integrated into the larger Goth's Wall, a chain of fortifications stretching across the Taman Peninsula. German engineers turned every factory, hillside, and dock into strong points connected by trenches, bunkers, and minefields. The terrain was an ally. The surrounding mountains provided observation points, and the narrow coastal plain limited the possibility of large Soviet armored assaults. The Soviet command, however, was determined to retake the city and eliminate the German presence from the Black Sea coast. For the Stavka, this objective had both strategic and political significance. The loss of Novorossiysk had cut vital supply lines to the Caucasus and diminished the operational flexibility of the Black Sea fleet. Moreover, reclaiming the port would complete the liberation of the North Caucasus and secure the approaches to Crimea. His forces included the 18th Army under General Leselidze, the 56th Army under General Melnik, and elements of the 47th Army. Naval support was to come from the Black Sea Fleet under Admiral Philip Oktyabrski. Throughout April and May 1943, Soviet engineers and reconnaissance units carefully studied the German defenses. The Semes Bay was heavily mined, both underwater and along the shoreline. German coastal batteries controlled every approach to the harbor, while anti-aircraft guns covered the skies. The port itself was littered with sunken ships, forming a barrier to landing craft. Despite these conditions, the Soviets planned a combined amphibious and land assault, an ambitious operation that required coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. The cornerstone of the Soviet plan was the use of the Malaya Zemlya bridgehead as a launching point. This narrow enclave, held since September 1942 by a small Soviet garrison, had resisted repeated German attempts to eliminate it. Commanded by Major Caesar Kunikov, the original landing force of Marines and infantry had dug into the rocky coastline, enduring constant artillery bombardment and air raids for months. Their continued presence allowed Soviet artillery to threaten German positions inside Novorossiysk and provided a forward base for renewed offensives. Though Kunikov was killed in February 1943, His detachment's defense became legendary throughout the Red Army. By mid-1943, Soviet preparations for a major offensive were nearly complete. Under the overall coordination of the North Caucasus Front, thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food were secretly stockpiled near Gelendzhik and Tuapse. The Black Sea Fleet began assembling a fleet of landing craft, minesweepers, and gunboats to support an amphibious strike on the city's harbor. Air support was assigned to the 4th Air Army, which was tasked with achieving local air superiority and neutralizing German artillery positions prior to the assault. The Germans were not unaware of Soviet intentions. Reconnaissance flights detected unusual naval activity along the coast, and intercepted communications hinted at an impending offensive. However, German intelligence misjudged the timing and direction of the main attack. The 17th Army expected a landing north of Novorossiysk or an attack across the Taman Peninsula, not a direct strike on the city's harbor itself. As a result, while defenses were strong overall, critical weaknesses existed in the coordination between German and Romanian units defending the shoreline. During June and July 1943, smaller Soviet attacks tested the German lines around Krimskaya and Verkhnebakanski. These engagements served a dual purpose. They fixed German reserves away from the city and provided valuable intelligence about Axis artillery positions. Soviet infantry suffered heavy casualties, but succeeded in drawing enemy attention inland, setting the stage for the main operation planned for late summer. At the same time, the weather and geography imposed severe challenges. The summer heat turned the narrow valleys into dust-filled furnaces, while supply routes across the mountains were vulnerable to Luftwaffe attacks. The Black Sea Fleet faced the constant threat of German torpedo boats and aircraft operating from Anapa and Kerch. Despite these risks, Admiral Oktyabrski insisted on maintaining a steady flow of supplies and reinforcements to the Malaya Zemlya bridgehead using small, fast boats that operated under cover of darkness. Losses were heavy, but the supply line never broke. Behind the front, partisan activity in the Kuban region increased dramatically. Local resistance groups, supported by Soviet intelligence, sabotaged railway lines and ambushed German convoys moving toward the Taman Peninsula. These operations disrupted the already stretched Axis logistics and created an atmosphere of constant insecurity in the rear areas. German reports from the period mention growing difficulties in maintaining transport and communication, particularly due to partisan attacks along the Novorossiysk-Krimskaya Railway. By August 1943, both sides were aware that a decisive confrontation was imminent. The Germans fortified their positions and evacuated civilians from the remaining parts of the city. The Soviets completed their preparations under strict secrecy, concentrating nearly 100,000 men, over 400 tanks, and more than 1,000 artillery pieces for the coming assault. The Naval Landing Force, drawn from the 255th and 83rd Marine Brigades, trained relentlessly in nighttime operations along the coast near Gelendzhik. As the summer drew to an end, the final orders were issued. The Soviet plan, named Operation Neptune, envisioned a powerful amphibious strike on the port combined with a simultaneous breakthrough from the north and east. The objective was to split the German garrison, seize the harbor, and advance inland toward the Taman Peninsula. The date was set for the first week of September 1943. In the final days of August, the Black Sea was quiet, deceptively so. Soviet gunboats and minesweepers began moving into position, their movements masked by fog and nightfall. In the hills overlooking the city, Soviet artillerymen prepared their guns, and radio silence was imposed across all fronts. After nearly a year of stalemate, Novorossiysk was about to become the stage of one of the most daring combined operations of the entire Eastern Front. In the early hours, the night was overcast, and the sea lay calm under a faint moonlight, conditions chosen deliberately for concealment. At 02:44, after a brief artillery preparation, the Black Sea Fleet opened fire with its coastal batteries and naval guns positioned near Gelendzhik and Cape Dube. Within minutes, the shoreline of Novorossiysk erupted in explosions. German bunkers along the harbor and the approaches to the port were engulfed in flame and smoke. Simultaneously, searchlights cut across the night sky as the 83rd Marine Brigade and elements of the 255th Separate Marine Brigade boarded landing craft, their engines muffled to reduce noise. The Naval Assault Force, commanded by Captain First Rank Georgy Kolostiakov, consisted of roughly 2,600 men. Their target was the southern section of Novorossiysk's harbor, the so-called Old Town industrial area, heavily fortified by German minesweepers cleared a narrow passage through the bay, but several vessels were lost to hidden mines and artillery fire from the shore. By WW2, the first wave of landing craft approached the piers under intense machine gun fire. Smoke screens laid by Soviet boats partially obscured their movements, but the defenders responded with deadly precision. The Luftwaffe, alerted by radar and observation posts, scrambled aircraft from nearby airfields, but the first sorties arrived too late to stop the initial landing. The Marines leapt into waist-deep water, dragging weapons and ammunition through the surf. The noise was overwhelming. Artillery shells from both sides exploding in the water, tracer fire streaking through the darkness. Casualties were heavy during the first 20 minutes of the landing, yet the Soviet troops managed to establish a small foothold on the southern quay. Engineers immediately began clearing mines and obstacles, while assault detachments moved inland to capture warehouses and factories that had been converted into strongpoints. On land, the 18th Army began its coordinated offensive from the east. Soviet artillery unleashed a concentrated barrage on the German positions around Verkhnebakansky and Miskako, followed by an advance of infantry supported by tanks from the 5th Guards Tank Brigade. The goal was to break through the mountain passes leading directly into the city and link up with the naval landing force. However, the terrain made progress extremely difficult. Narrow gorges and heavily mined roads slowed the attack, and German defenders, primarily from the 125th Infantry Regiment and elements of the 4th Mountain Division, used pre-sighted artillery to devastating effect. The German command, led by General Rudolf Conrad, quickly recognized the danger of the reinforcements were ordered from the northern sector, but communication difficulties and partisan sabotage delayed their arrival. The garrison in the city, numbering about 10,000 men, fought with determination. They were supported by artillery positions on the surrounding hills and several batteries of 88mm guns that dominated the port area. For the Soviets, the key challenge was to expand the beachhead before daylight made further reinforcement impossible. By dawn, elements of the 83rd Marine Brigade had secured the cement factory and nearby rail depot, crucial positions for sustaining the landing. Yet the situation remained critical. German counterattacks began at Euro 6:30, employing tanks and flamethrower teams in an attempt to drive the Marines back into the sea. The Soviets repelled these attacks with anti-tank rifles and close-range explosives. In one instance, a platoon of Marines armed with captured Panzerfausts destroyed. Meanwhile, the second wave of Soviet landing craft brought reinforcements and ammunition under constant enemy fire. Minesweepers continued to clear the bay, while gunboats from the Black Sea Fleet provided fire support at point-blank range. Admiral Oktyabrski, observing from his flagship Red Caucasus, directed naval artillery to suppress German batteries on Cape Love and the western shore. The accuracy of these bombardments proved decisive, silencing several key gun emplacements that had been inflicting severe losses on the landing force. The 18th Army's offensive toward the city began to gather momentum by mid-morning. Soviet infantry, supported by self-propelled guns, captured several key ridges overlooking the port. The connection between the land forces and the naval landing was finally established around noon, effectively splitting the German defenses into isolated pockets. Despite continuous Luftwaffe bombing runs, Soviet positions along the shoreline held firm. The Marines used every available building for cover, turning the industrial zone into a network of strongpoints. The Germans launched repeated counterattacks during the afternoon and evening, but coordination began to falter. Communications were disrupted, and ammunition shortages became severe. The Romanian units, particularly the 10th Infantry Division, suffered heavy losses and were forced to withdraw toward the city's northern outskirts. German commanders attempted to reorganize their lines, but the relentless Soviet pressure made it impossible. For the Soviet troops, the battle was fought meter by meter. The streets were filled with rubble, and snipers occupied every surviving structure. Tanks could barely maneuver, forcing infantry to engage in close-quarter combat with grenades and submachine guns. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to restore the harbor facilities. By evening, several more waves of Marines and infantry had landed, swelling the Soviet presence in the city to over 8,000 men. By September 11th, the situation had shifted decisively. The Soviets controlled much of the southern and central harbor area, while the Germans held the western districts and the high ground beyond the city. Artillery duels continued throughout the night, illuminating the shattered skyline. Both sides had suffered immense casualties in just 24 hours of combat. Estimates suggest nearly 5,000 Soviet and 3,500 German losses by this stage. The next phase of the battle would determine whether the landing could expand into a full liberation or become another isolated, costly foothold. Soviet commanders pressed their advantage, preparing for a combined assault from both the land forces pushing south and the naval troops entrenched in the ruins of Novorossiysk. The 18th Army, under General Konstantin Leselidze, had successfully advanced from the east and joined the Marines by mid-morning. Together they began pressing toward the northern industrial zone and the German headquarters near the cement works. The fighting was brutal and disorienting. The narrow streets of Novorossiysk had turned into trenches of debris, with entire blocks reduced to heaps of concrete and rebar. Soviet infantry fought from building to building, using the cellars of destroyed houses as cover. The Germans countered with machine gun nests and pre-sighted artillery positioned on the western heights. Every corner, every factory wall was contested. German command attempted to stabilize the situation by transferring reserves from the Taman Peninsula, but their transport convoys were relentlessly bombed by Soviet aviation. The 5th Air Army and Black Sea Fleet aircraft maintained near constant air superiority over the bay, flying more than 600 sorties on September 12th alone. PE-2 dive bombers struck German artillery positions, while Il-2 ground attack aircraft strafed convoys and ammunition depots. The Luftwaffe, though still active, was in decline. Its depleted squadrons could not contest Soviet dominance effectively. For the first time in months, the Red Army had full control of the skies above Novorossiysk. By noon, Soviet engineers had managed to clear sections of the port for the landing of heavier equipment. Amphibious tanks and self-propelled guns were ferried across from Gelendzhik and joined the infantry in the northern part of the city. Naval guns from the cruiser Krasny Kavkaz and destroyers positioned offshore provided continuous bombardment against German strongpoints on Cape Love and the railway station area. The accuracy of these bombardments, coordinated by forward observers embedded with ground troops, broke several enemy positions that had resisted for days. However, progress came at a high cost. The Germans defended the western shore of the bay with determination. Snipers from the 4th Mountain Division took up positions in the upper floors of half-collapsed buildings, and anti-tank guns covered every approach. The Soviets suffered particularly heavy losses during their attempts to capture the city's northern oil tanks and the marshalling yard, where German flamethrower teams counterattacked repeatedly. The battle assumed a rhythm of advance by day and consolidation by night, each side clawing for a few hundred meters of ground. The situation on the German side was deteriorating rapidly. Supply lines across the Taman Peninsula were stretched to breaking point. Soviet artillery interdicted the roads leading to Anapa and Krimskaya, forcing German convoys to move only at night. Small convoys of barges and fishing vessels began ferrying wounded soldiers and critical equipment across the bay. Many of these were intercepted or sunk by Soviet coastal artillery. Meanwhile, the Soviet command intensified its efforts to annihilate the trapped defenders. On September 14th, fresh reinforcements arrived. The 55th Guards Rifle Division and units of the 5th Guards Tank Brigade, bringing the total Soviet strength in the city and surrounding area to approximately 45,000 troops. Against them stood no more than 12,000 Axis defenders, half of whom were already wounded or incapacitated. Throughout the following day, the city's center became the focal point of combat. Soviet units advanced under continuous cover of smoke and artillery fire, using captured German positions to mount their own guns. The resistance, though desperate, began to crumble. German radio communications broke down. The fall of Novorossiysk was now imminent. But the Soviet command remained cautious, aware that the enemy might attempt to turn the city into a delaying fortress for a broader retreat across the Kuban. The capture of Novorossiysk would soon mark not only a military success, but also the symbolic reassertion of Soviet control over the Black Sea coast. Yet, even in victory, the price was staggering. Tens of thousands dead, a city left in ruins, and the once thriving port reduced to ash and silence. By September 15, 1943, Novorossiysk was an inferno of twisted steel, broken masonry, and bodies. The Soviets had penetrated deep into the western districts, while German resistance was collapsing under unrelenting pressure. Yet, despite the city's devastation, the battle was not over. The Wehrmacht command still clung to the hope of organizing a coherent retreat, extracting as many units as possible across Tsemes Bay toward the Taman Peninsula. The bombardment shattered any remaining semblance of organized German defense. Fuel depots and ammunition stores detonated, sending columns of smoke into the gray morning sky. The ground trembled, and entire structures collapsed into the sea. Surviving German units, largely remnants of the 125th Infantry Regiment and several Romanian companies, retreated street by street, leaving behind scores of dead and wounded. Many of the defenders were now cut off from communication with higher command and fought independently in small groups. Amid the bombardment, Soviet Marines advanced through the ruins, clearing resistance with grenades and submachine guns. The city's port area became the scene of the final struggle. German soldiers barricaded themselves inside warehouses, using machine guns and snipers to slow the Soviet advance. Soviet flamethrower teams and engineers were deployed to clear these strongpoints. The intense fighting in the port lasted nearly 8 hours, with Soviet casualties reaching 1,800 in a single day. Still, by the afternoon of September 16th, red flags began appearing on the quays, marking the end of organized resistance in the southern sector. Simultaneously, the 318th Rifle Division, attacking from the north, stormed the cement factory area, a heavily fortified complex that had resisted capture since the first landings. The factory's reinforced concrete walls had been converted into a fortress, equipped with machine gun nests, mortars, and interlocking fields of fire. Soviet infantry, supported by artillery and close-range tank fire, fought through each level of the building. The combat was methodical and grueling, taking more than 12 hours to clear. By nightfall, the last German positions were eliminated, and the Soviets secured full control of the northern industrial zone. As darkness fell, the remaining Axis forces attempted a desperate evacuation. Around 2,000 German and Romanian soldiers assembled at the western quays, trying to board small craft bound for the Taman Peninsula. However, Soviet coastal artillery from positions on the eastern shore and naval guns from the cruiser Krasny Kavkaz opened fire, sinking many of the escaping vessels. Few reached the opposite shore. Those who did often found themselves without supplies or support as the Soviet Air Force bombed retreating convoys the following morning. By September 17th, organized German resistance in Novorossiysk had ceased. Only scattered pockets of wounded and isolated soldiers remained in the outskirts. The city was officially declared liberated at 09:00 that morning. The red banner of the 318th Rifle Division was raised over the city's main railway station, a symbol of victory that was immediately reported to the Soviet High Command. Marshal Budyani, overseeing operations in the North Caucasus Front, sent a message to Stalin confirming the complete liberation of the Black Sea port. The cost of this triumph was immense. In the course of 7 days of continuous combat, Soviet forces lost approximately 21,000 men, including killed and wounded. German and Romanian losses were estimated at 16,000, with another 2,500 taken prisoner. The port itself was almost completely destroyed. 90% of industrial facilities were in ruins, the docks rendered unusable, and the residential areas leveled. Only fragments of infrastructure remained standing, including portions of the cement plant and several oil storage tanks. Despite the scale of destruction, the strategic importance of the victory was enormous. The fall of Novorossiysk effectively sealed the fate of the German 17th Army's positions on the Taman Peninsula. With the loss of the port, Soviet naval control of the bay also eliminated the possibility of sea-based evacuation on a large scale. Within 3 weeks, the Soviets would launch the Novorossiysk-Taman offensive, clearing the remaining German forces from the Kuban bridgehead entirely by October 9, 1943. The liberation also carried symbolic weight. Novorossiysk had endured over a year of occupation, during which German forces had executed hundreds of civilians, deported many more to labor camps, and destroyed nearly every industrial and cultural landmark. The Soviet government quickly declared the city a hero city, recognizing both its defenders and its suffering population. Reconstruction began almost immediately, even as fighting continued farther west along the coast. For the Red Army, the victory at Novorossiysk represented not only the recovery of a vital port, but also the consolidation of its southern flank in preparation for future offensives toward Crimea and the lower Dnieper. The success of the Amphibious operation, executed under fire and against a fortified coastal position, was studied closely by Soviet planners and became a model for subsequent Black Sea operations. In the ruins of the city, the scale of the human cost became clear. The harbor waters were littered with the wreckage of ships and landing craft. Thousands of bodies lay unburied among the debris. Yet amid this devastation, Soviet soldiers raised their banners and declared that Novorossiysk lived again, a city reborn from its ashes, standing as both a grave and a symbol of endurance on the Black Sea shore. The liberation of Novorossiysk on September 17, 1943, marked the culmination of one of the most complex combined arms operations of the Southern Front. But the victory did not bring immediate relief. The city itself was a ruin, and the front line remained perilously close. German artillery from positions on the Taman Peninsula continued to shell the port area for several days after the official Soviet announcement of liberation. Engineers and infantry patrols still moved cautiously through the wreckage, clearing mines and searching for hidden German stragglers left behind to sabotage supply routes. The Soviet High Command immediately turned its attention to the next strategic task: the liquidation of the German bridgehead on the Taman Peninsula, the last foothold of the Wehrmacht in the North Caucasus. The fall of Novorossiysk had created a breach in the Axis coastal defense line, opening the route toward Anapa and Temryuk. Using the port's partially restored facilities, the Black Sea Fleet began landing reinforcements, ammunition, and engineering equipment to support the next phase of the offensive. Despite massive damage, Soviet engineers restored one of the piers and several storage areas. By early October, the port could handle small cargo vessels again, providing a logistical link for ongoing operations along the coast. Meanwhile, the human toll within the city became painfully clear. Soviet medics and local residents unearthed mass graves on the northern outskirts and near the railway depot. NKVD field investigators documented evidence of executions and deportations carried out during the German occupation. According to post-war Soviet archives, Approximately 7,000 civilians were killed or deported between September 1942 and September 1943. The occupation authorities had established labor camps in the cement factory complex and near the oil storage facilities, where prisoners worked under brutal conditions. The returning Red food supplies were scarce, clean water was limited, and medical facilities were overwhelmed. The city's infrastructure, electric power, waterworks, and transportation, was almost entirely obliterated. Temporary kitchens and field hospitals were established by the 47th Army and the Red Cross. Naval repair crews began dismantling wrecked ships in the harbor to clear the channels, while soldiers helped to bury the dead and extinguish the last fires in the industrial district. Despite these grim conditions, morale within the Soviet ranks was high. The recapture of Novorossiysk was seen as proof that the Red Army had regained full initiative in the southern theater. The news was broadcast across the Soviet Union as part of a wider narrative of liberation. Pravda and Krasnaya Zvezda published frontline reports describing the heroism of the Marines and the defenders who had held the Malaya Zemlya bridgehead. Though heavily propagandized, these reports boosted public morale and reinforced the image of the Soviet soldier as resilient and unstoppable even in the harshest conditions. German records captured later provide a starkly different perspective. Reports from the 17th Army described the defense of Novorossiysk as a catastrophe of command and supply. The loss of sea control, the collapse of communications, and the attrition caused by constant artillery fire had made the position untenable. By mid-September, many units were reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Some companies counted fewer than 40 men. A post-battle assessment by German staff officers concluded that the city's defense absorbed more resources than its strategic value justified, yet Hitler's refusal to permit early withdrawal condemned thousands to destruction. In the weeks following the battle, the Soviet advance continued methodically west. The German forces retreating across the Taman Peninsula were pursued by both ground troops and naval aviation. The 56th Army moved from the direction of Krimskaya, while the 18th Army pressed from Novorossiysk. The coordination between ground and naval forces, refined through the operation, allowed the Red Army to outflank several German positions and capture Anapa by the end of September. Back in Novorossiysk, reconstruction began almost immediately. Soviet engineers prioritized the clearing of the port and the rebuilding of coastal artillery positions to defend against potential counterattacks. Within weeks, the first supply convoys arrived with materials from Poti and Tuapse. Civilians began to return from evacuation zones, and temporary housing was erected from the rubble of destroyed buildings. Though it would take years to rebuild the city fully, Novorossiysk's revival started amid the smoking ruins, driven by both necessity and the symbolic weight of its survival. The fall of the city had broken the German coastal defense line and left the 17th Army's positions in the Kuban bridgehead dangerously exposed. From late September to early October 1943, Soviet troops pressed westward toward Anapa, Temryuk, and Taman, seeking to annihilate the last remnants of Axis forces still entrenched on the mainland before they could evacuate to Crimea. Novorossiysk itself now functioned as the logistical heart of this operation. Though still scarred and partially flooded, the port became operational within days. Black Sea Fleet vessels began using it as a forward supply base, unloading artillery shells, food, and medical supplies under constant threat of air raids. Soviet engineers, working around the clock, cleared unexploded ordnance and rebuilt several docking cranes from scrap. The 18th Army's command post moved into the city to direct ongoing operations. Despite the destruction, Novorossiysk served again as a functioning military harbor, a symbol of how the front had shifted irreversibly in the Soviets' favor. For the German command, the situation on the Taman Peninsula deteriorated rapidly. After losing Novorossiysk, General Ruoff's forces were compressed into a shrinking coastal pocket between Anapa and Temryuk. Soviet artillery and naval guns targeted the evacuation routes relentlessly. The 17th Army's strength had dropped to about 150,000 men, while Soviet forces advancing from both east and north numbered over 300,000. Air superiority was now completely in Soviet hands. Daily bombing raids destroyed supply dumps, vehicles, and pontoon bridges. The Luftwaffe, unable to contest the skies effectively, resorted to night operations to cover the evacuation of troops across the Kerch. The 18th and 56th Armies coordinated their advance to encircle remaining German and Romanian formations. By late September, the Soviets had taken Anapa and cut off the main road leading to Temryuk. The German evacuation, known as Operation Brunhild, began under constant fire. Over 21,000 troops were evacuated by sea between September 21st and October 9th, but tens of thousands of men and large quantities of heavy equipment were abandoned. The final German units withdrew from the Taman Peninsula on October 9th, marking the end of the long struggle for the Caucasus and the Black Sea coast. Novorossiysk, now fully secure, became the main base for the next stage of operations, the liberation of Crimea. The port's location made it ideal for launching amphibious assaults and supplying advancing forces along the coast. Repair battalions worked to restore the naval base, while transport ships brought reinforcements and construction materials. In the months that followed, Soviet authorities launched investigations into war crimes committed during the occupation. Testimonies collected by the NKVD and the Extraordinary State Commission documented executions, deportations, and forced labor. Several German officers captured during the retreat were tried and executed in 1944. The findings were later presented at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of Axis crimes on Soviet territory. The victory at Novorossiysk also had significant political impact. It was presented by Soviet propaganda as a model of combined army and naval cooperation. The heroism of the Marines, particularly those of the 83rd Brigade, who had held the Malaya Zemlya bridgehead for 7 months under constant attack, became a central element in wartime rhetoric. Official dispatches emphasized the unity of army, navy, and people, portraying Novorossiysk as one of the few deep-water ports on the Black Sea capable of supporting naval operations. It was indispensable for the next phase of the Southern Campaign, the offensive toward Crimea and Sevastopol. By November, engineers of the Black Sea Fleet, supported by the 18th Army's technical battalions, had repaired 2 loading quays, reconstructed a small section of the rail line to Tuapse, and restored a limited power supply using portable generators. Cranes salvaged from the ruins were welded back into service. The first supply ships entered the port under escort from the destroyer Nezamojnik, unloading ammunition and food for advancing troops. The people of the city lived among ruins. Most houses were without roofs or windows. Families built shelters out of debris and ship planks. With winter approaching, Soviet authorities distributed stoves, blankets, and clothing from emergency reserves stored in the Caucasus. Rations were minimal: bread, canned fish, and sometimes dried fruits brought by sea. Still, the morale among the population was unusually high. Novorossiysk had been liberated after 13 months of occupation and over a year of continuous combat in its surroundings. For many survivors, rebuilding the city was not only a duty, but an act of defiance. Across the region, remnants of the German occupation became visible as Soviet investigators documented atrocities and destruction. Reports by the Extraordinary State Commission recorded the systematic demolition of industrial sites, the deportation of skilled workers to Germany, and the execution of prisoners of war. In the city's northern outskirts, a mass grave containing more than 1,200 civilians was uncovered. These findings served both judicial and propagandistic purposes. For the military, the restored port of Novorossiysk quickly became an operational hub. Supplies, reinforcements, and repair materials flowed through the harbor, feeding the offensive that would soon strike across the Kerch Strait into Crimea. The 18th Army was redeployed westward, while the Black Sea Fleet expanded its coastal patrols, securing sea routes from enemy interference. By December, the port handled up to 1,000 tons of cargo daily, an extraordinary achievement given the city's condition only weeks before. The city's defenses were also rebuilt. New coastal artillery batteries were installed on the surrounding hills, replacing those destroyed during the battle. Anti-aircraft regiments of the 46th Army Corps established firing positions to protect the harbor from Luftwaffe raids, which continued sporadically throughout the winter. Although the air raids inflicted occasional damage, none could disrupt the rapid recovery underway. For the Red Army and the Soviet people, the city's rebirth embodied both vengeance and hope. A city destroyed, resurrected, and once again vital to the struggle for control of the Black Sea. By the beginning of 1944, Novorossiysk had transformed from a battlefield into a functioning military and industrial base. Though its ruins still testified to the scale of destruction, the city was again alive with movement. Convoys arriving by rail from Krasnodar, naval ships docking in the port, and columns of workers clearing debris under the supervision of Army engineers. The once silent harbor, choked with wrecks only months earlier, now echoed with the clang of hammers and the steady rhythm of reconstruction. For the Soviet command, this rebirth was more than symbolic. It provided the foundation for the next stage of operations along the Black Sea. By January 1944, it had become one of the primary logistical hubs supporting the Crimean and southern Ukrainian offensives. Soviet naval headquarters re-established communication centers and radio posts in the restored administrative buildings near the waterfront. Warehouses were rebuilt using materials transported from Poti and Tuapse, while captured German cranes were repurposed for unloading ammunition and heavy equipment. Within 3 months, the harbor's daily handling capacity reached 2,000 tons, double what it had been immediately after liberation. The city's population, however, still suffered. More than 70% of its housing stock had been destroyed. Most families lived in wooden barracks or in the basements of half-collapsed buildings. The government introduced a rationing system and organized sabotniks, voluntary labor days during which women and children played a crucial role in reconstruction efforts, clearing rubble, repairing roads, and planting crops in the surrounding fields to restore local food supplies. Military units stationed in Novorossiysk contributed to both defense and rebuilding. The Black Sea Fleet maintained constant patrols in the bay to prevent sabotage, while the 46th Army provided manpower and logistical support. Engineers continued removing mines and unexploded shells from both the city and the harbor. According to post-war Soviet reports, over 12,000 mines and explosives were cleared by the end of 1944. Every stretch of street, every pier, and every factory site was inspected and reclaimed, allowing gradual restoration of normal life. Meanwhile, the memory of the battle became a central part of Soviet wartime culture. Official ceremonies, the defense and liberation of Novorossiysk were featured prominently in newsreels and newspapers. In early 1944, the Soviet government awarded the city the title of Hero City, recognizing both the courage of its defenders and the suffering of its inhabitants. This title placed Novorossiysk among other key symbols of national endurance, alongside Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Sevastopol. The surviving veterans of the operation were dispersed across new fronts, many taking part in the Crimean campaign later that year. Their experience in amphibious warfare proved invaluable. The lessons learned at Novorossiysk, the coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, shaped subsequent operations across the Black Sea, including the landings at Kerch and Feodosia. Military academies studied the battle in detail, and its tactics were incorporated into Soviet manuals on coastal assault and urban combat. For the Germans, the fall of the port deprived them of a vital Black Sea supply base and exposed their remaining forces in the Crimea to encirclement. Intercepted German communications from early 1944 revealed concerns about the Soviet ability to use Novorossiysk as a staging ground for naval operations deep into Axis-held waters. In this sense, the victory was not merely local. It shifted the entire balance of power in the southern theater. Despite official triumphalism, the scars of war remained everywhere. Many of the city's industrial workers had been killed or deported during the occupation, creating a shortage of skilled labor. Reconstruction was carried out largely by demobilized soldiers and evacuated workers returning from the Urals and Transcaucasia. The cement plant, once the centerpiece of the local economy and a key defensive position during the battle, was rebuilt in phases and returned to partial operation. The victory ensured Soviet control over the entire Caucasian coastline, secured the naval bases needed for future operations, and allowed the Black Sea Fleet to resume full-scale activity against Axis shipping. With the German 17th Army forced out of the Taman Peninsula, the Soviet command could redirect manpower and resources toward the decisive Crimean and southern Ukrainian offensives of 1944. In strategic terms, the city's recapture closed the final chapter of the Caucasus campaign, ending nearly 2 years of German attempts to hold the southern front. Politically, the triumph carried immense weight. Stalin's leadership presented Novorossiysk as an example of the Soviet people's unbreakable will. The defense of the Malaya Zemlya bridgehead was immortalized in state propaganda, and the harbor was littered with shipwrecks and unexploded ordnance. The surrounding hills were scarred with craters and trenches that would remain visible for decades. Reconstruction became an all-encompassing national project. Soviet engineers, soldiers, and volunteers from across the Union participated in rebuilding the port and housing. By 1945, Novorossiysk had regained basic functionality as a commercial harbor and naval base. In the post-war years, reconstruction accelerated further. Industrial plants were modernized, new shipyards were established, and entire districts were rebuilt on the ruins of the old. The process was long and costly, but it restored the city's role as a vital economic and military center of the Black Sea. In the post-war decades, Novorossiysk's history remained deeply intertwined with the memory of the Great Patriotic War. Veterans associations and war memorials preserved the legacy of the battle. Annual commemorations honored the defenders of the city, and the site of the Malaya Zemlya bridgehead became a national shrine. In 1973, on the 30th anniversary of liberation, Novorossiysk was officially granted the title of Hero City, formal recognition of the sacrifices made during its defense and recapture. Monuments and museums soon followed, turning the once ruined port into a place of pilgrimage for generations who sought to understand the human endurance behind Soviet victory. Historically, the Battle of Novorossiysk demonstrated the evolution of Soviet military capability. It was one of the first major operations where amphibious landings, urban combat, and coordinated air-naval support were integrated successfully under a single operational command. The experience gained there informed later Soviet amphibious assaults, including the operations in Crimea and the Danube Delta. The Battle of Novorossiysk remains one of the defining episodes of the Eastern Front. The struggle of a port that refused to vanish, of defenders who held the line until liberation came from the sea. It stands as a testament to the resilience of a city that would not die, whose survival became part of the Soviet Union's very narrative of endurance and rebirth. The Black Sea fortress that, even amid fire and ruin, never surrendered its place in history.